Caleb Hartley's hand had touched her bare skin for exactly 2 seconds in the trading post, just long enough to keep them both from falling. Now she stood in his doorway with armed warriors behind her, finger pointed at his chest, declaring he would marry her by sunset or die. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning Caleb Hartley rode into Bitter Creek Trading Post, he had exactly 3 things on his mind: whiskey, supplies, and finding a way to forget the war that still haunted his dreams. What he did not expect was the young woman who would change everything he thought he knew about fate, honor, and the kind of love that crosses worlds. He had been riding for 6 days straight, pushing his chestnut mare harder than he should have across the Montana territory, trying to outrun memories that refused to stay buried. The trading post appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its weathered wooden buildings promising at least temporary relief from the endless grasslands and the ghosts that seemed to ride alongside him. Caleb was 28 years old, though the silver already threading through his dark hair and the hard lines around his eyes made him look older. 4 years of cavalry service and 2 more of drifting had stripped away whatever softness he might have once possessed. The trading post sat at the intersection of 2 worlds, a place where settlers and natives exchanged goods and wary glances in equal measure. It was neutral ground, respected by both sides through an uneasy agreement that benefited everyone involved. Caleb had been here before, 3 winters past, when the owner had been a fat Scotsman named McGregor, who watered his whiskey and overcharged for everything. He wondered if the old thief was still running the place, or if the territory had finally swallowed him whole. He dismounted outside the main building, his legs stiff from too many hours in the saddle, and tied his mare to the hitching post. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful if he had still possessed the capacity to notice such things. Instead, he focused on the practical matters at hand: water for his horse, food for himself, and enough whiskey to quiet the screaming in his head for one blessed night. The interior of the trading post was dim and crowded with goods of every description: furs stacked against one wall, barrels of flour and salt along another, and glass cases displaying knives, jewelry, and the various trinkets that passed between cultures in places like this. Several people moved through the space, settlers and trappers mostly, their conversations dying to whispers as they noticed the worn cavalry insignia still visible on his jacket. Caleb ignored them. He had grown accustomed to the suspicious looks that followed former soldiers, especially those who wore their service like a scar they could not quite hide. He was reaching for a bottle of rye on a high shelf when it happened, the moment that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude and set in motion events he could never have imagined. A woman stepped backward without looking, directly into his path, and he instinctively caught her arm to prevent them both from falling. It was nothing, a heartbeat of contact, his calloused fingers wrapping around her bare forearm for perhaps 2 seconds before they both steadied themselves and stepped apart. She turned to face him, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest that he could not name. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with skin the color of autumn honey, and eyes so dark they seemed to hold the night sky within them. Her black hair hung in 2 thick braids over her shoulders, decorated with beads of turquoise and bone that clicked softly when she moved. She wore a dress of pale buckskin adorned with intricate beadwork across the bodice, traditional clothing that marked her as belonging to one of the Lakota bands that still maintained their customs, despite the encroaching tide of settlement. For a moment she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then something flickered across her features, something that might have been surprise or recognition or perhaps calculation. Caleb released a breath he had not realized he was holding and touched the brim of his hat in apology. "Pardon me, miss. Did not see you there." She did not respond, only continued to study him with those fathomless dark eyes, as if she were seeing something beyond his weather-worn face and travel-stained clothing. The intensity of her gaze made him uncomfortable in ways he could not explain, like she was reading secrets written on his soul that even he did not know existed. Before he could say anything else, she turned and walked away, disappearing through a doorway at the back of the trading post. Caleb shook his head, dismissing the strange encounter, and returned his attention to the whiskey. He had learned long ago not to dwell on things he did not understand, and a pretty native woman with unsettling eyes fell squarely into that category. He paid for his supplies and his liquor, arranged for a bed in the small bunkhouse attached to the trading post, and spent the evening doing exactly what he had planned, drinking until the memories faded to a dull roar instead of the screaming nightmare they usually became. The whiskey was better than he expected, and by the time the moon rose high over the prairie, he had almost forgotten the woman with the dark eyes and the beaded dress. Almost. He dreamed of her that night, though the dreams made no sense. She stood on a hillside covered in wildflowers, speaking words in a language he did not understand, while behind her the sky burned with colors that had no names. When he reached for her, she smiled, and the smile held both promise and warning in equal measure. He woke with the dawn, his head throbbing and his mouth tasting of regret, and pushed himself upright on the narrow cot. The bunkhouse was empty, the other travelers already gone about their business, and pale light filtered through the single window to illuminate dust motes dancing in the air. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream, and reached for his boots. He was halfway through pulling on the second one when the door burst open, and the morning he thought would be ordinary transformed into something else entirely. 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the rising sun, and Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol hanging on the bedpost before he registered who they were. The woman from the trading post stood in the center, her dark eyes blazing with an emotion he could not identify. Behind her loomed an older man wearing the full regalia of a Lakota chief, his face weathered by decades of prairie wind and painted with symbols of authority. To the woman's left stood a younger warrior, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, his expression making clear that violence was merely a word away. But it was the woman who commanded the room, who fixed Caleb with a stare that pinned him to the cot like a butterfly on a collector's board. She raised her hand and pointed directly at him, her finger steady and accusatory, and when she spoke, her English was clear and precise. "You touched me, cowboy. Sacred law demands that you take me as your wife." Caleb stared at the woman, certain he had misheard her words or that the whiskey from the night before had done more damage to his faculties than he realized. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, and he became acutely aware that his pistol was hanging on the bedpost well out of reach while the warrior's hand remained firmly on his knife. "I beg your pardon," he said slowly, his voice rough from sleep and liquor. "I do not think I understood what you just said." The woman's expression did not change. Her finger remained pointed at his chest like an accusation made flesh, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You touched my bare skin yesterday in the trading post. Among my people, when a man touches an unmarried woman in such a manner, he has claimed her. Sacred law demands that you take me as your wife or face the consequences of your dishonor. Now wait just a moment." Caleb held up both hands, palms outward, the universal gesture of peaceful intention. "I barely brushed your arm for 2 seconds to keep us both from falling. That was not any kind of claiming. That was common courtesy." The older man behind her spoke then, his voice deep and resonant with authority. His English was more heavily accented than the woman's, but equally clear. "Our ways are not your ways, white soldier. But you stand on land that still belongs to the Lakota, and you will respect our customs or you will answer for the insult you have given my daughter." "Your daughter." Caleb looked from the chief to the young woman, seeing now the resemblance in the proud set of their jaws, and the fierce intelligence burning in their dark eyes. He felt the situation shifting beneath his feet like quicksand, drawing him deeper into something he did not understand and had never intended. "Sir, I meant no disrespect to your daughter or to your people. I was simply trying to prevent an accident. Surely there must be some way to resolve this misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding." The woman lowered her hand but did not step back. Her gaze remained locked on his face with an intensity that made his skin prickle with unease. "The law is clear. You touched me. You must take me as wife, or my father will be within his rights to demand your life as payment for the dishonor you have brought upon our family." Caleb's mind raced through his options, finding none of them particularly appealing. He was outnumbered 3-1, unarmed, and in territory where the Lakota still held considerable power, despite the treaties that had supposedly opened these lands to settlement. Even if he managed to fight his way out of this room, he would be hunted across the prairie by warriors who knew this country far better than he ever could. But marriage? To a woman he had never spoken to until this moment, from a culture he barely understood, bound by laws he had never agreed to follow. The very idea was absurd, impossible, a trap that had closed around him before he even knew it existed. "This is madness," he said, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "I am a drifter, a former soldier with nothing to offer any woman. I have no home, no land, no prospects worth mentioning. Your daughter deserves better than what I could provide." Something flickered in the woman's eyes at his words, something that might have been surprise or perhaps reassessment. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You think I do this because I want a husband? You think this is some desperate attempt to trap a white man into caring for me?" "I do not know what to think," Caleb admitted. "I know only that I walked into a trading post to buy whiskey and supplies, and now I am being told I must marry a woman whose name I do not even know. My name is Winona." Her chin lifted with pride that seemed to fill the room. "I am the daughter of Chief Running Bear of the Oglala Lakota, and I am no more pleased about this situation than you are. But the law is the law, and it exists to protect women from men who would take liberties without consequence. I took no liberties." Frustration crept into his voice despite his efforts to remain calm. "I caught your arm to keep you from falling. Any decent man would have done the same. And any decent man must accept the responsibility that comes with his actions." Winona's voice remained steady, but he could hear something beneath her composure now, a tension that suggested this situation was not as straightforward as she wanted him to believe. "Among my people, a woman's honor is sacred. Once touched by a man who is not her family, she is considered marked. If you refuse to marry me, I will be shamed, unable to marry anyone else. I will live the rest of my days as an outcast among my own people." The weight of her words settled over Caleb like a physical burden. He had not asked for this responsibility, had not chosen to participate in customs he did not understand, but the consequences of his refusal would fall entirely upon her. Whatever trap this might be, she was caught in it just as surely as he was. He looked at the chief, searching the older man's weathered face for some indication of flexibility, some sign that negotiation might be possible. Running Bear's expression remained impassive, carved from stone by decades of leadership and hard decisions. The warrior beside him had not moved, had not spoken, but his presence was a constant reminder that this conversation could end in blood as easily as in words. "How long," Caleb asked slowly, "do I have to make this decision?" Running Bear's eyes narrowed slightly. "You have until the sun sets today. If you have not agreed to marry my daughter by then, your life is forfeit." Caleb drew a deep breath and released it slowly. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been finding enough whiskey to quiet his nightmares. Now he faced a choice between marriage to a stranger and death on the Montana prairie, and he had less than a day to decide which fate he preferred. "I need time to think," he said, "and I would speak with your daughter alone if you will permit it." Running Bear considered the request for a long moment, his dark eyes moving between Caleb and his daughter, with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he gave a single sharp nod and spoke to Winona in their native language, words that Caleb could not understand, but whose meaning seemed clear enough from the way she stiffened slightly before inclining her head in acknowledgement. "You will have 1 hour," the chief said to Caleb. "My son Grey Wolf will wait outside the door. If you attempt to harm my daughter or escape through the window, he will kill you before you take 3 steps, I understand." Caleb kept his hands visible and his movements slow as the 2 men withdrew from the room, the door closing behind them with a finality that seemed to echo in the small space. He could hear Grey Wolf's footsteps just outside, pacing back and forth like a caged predator waiting for any excuse to strike. Winona stood near the window, her arms crossed over the beadwork on her chest, watching him with those unsettling dark eyes. In the morning light filtering through the dusty glass, he could see details he had missed the day before: the delicate turquoise pendant at her throat, the small scar near her left eyebrow, the way her fingers tightened on her arms as if she were holding herself together through sheer force of will. "So," Caleb said, breaking the heavy silence, "would you like to tell me what is really going on here?" Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the composed facade she had maintained since bursting through his door. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have spent enough time around people who are lying to recognize the signs." He sat down on the edge of the cot, deliberately making himself smaller and less threatening. "You are scared, but not of me. You want this marriage to happen, but not for the reasons you gave. And your father is going along with this charade, even though I suspect he knows as well as I do that accidentally catching someone's arm does not constitute a marriage claim in any culture." Winona was silent for so long that he thought she might simply refuse to answer. Then her shoulders sagged slightly, and she moved to sit on the room's single wooden chair, putting distance between them, while also surrendering some of the aggressive posture she had maintained. "You are more observant than I expected," she said quietly. "Most white men see only what they want to see when they look at my people. I spent 4 years in the cavalry." Caleb's voice carried old pain that he could not quite suppress. "I saw plenty of things I did not want to see. It taught me to pay attention to what is actually in front of me rather than what I expect to find." She studied him with renewed interest, as if he had transformed into something she had not anticipated. "You fought against my people. I fought in the war between the states. After that, I was stationed at various forts throughout the territory. I never raised my weapon against the Lakota, but I saw enough of how both sides treated each other to lose whatever illusions I might have had about honor and righteousness, and yet you wear your cavalry jacket still." Caleb glanced down at the worn blue fabric, the insignia that marked him as belonging to a world he had tried so hard to leave behind. "It is the only coat I own." He looked back at her, steering the conversation away from his own history. "But we were not talking about me. We were talking about why you need to marry a stranger badly enough to manufacture a sacred law to make it happen." Winona's hands twisted together in her lap, the first sign of nervousness she had displayed since entering the room. "I did not manufacture the law. The custom exists, though it is rarely invoked in modern times. But you are right that I had reasons for seeking you out specifically, and those reasons are..." She took a deep breath, seeming to gather her courage. "There is a man among my people named Stone Dog. He is a warrior of some reputation, and he has been pressing my father to give me to him as wife for nearly 2 years. My father has refused because I have refused, but Stone Dog's influence is growing. He has allies among the younger warriors who believe our people have been too accommodating to the white settlers, that we should return to the old ways of raiding and warfare. Caleb began to see the shape of the trap, though not yet all its dimensions. And if you marry Stone Dog, it strengthens his position. If I marry Stone Dog, I become the property of a man who sees women as tools to be used and discarded. Winona's voice hardened with barely contained fury. I have seen how he treats those who are weaker than himself. I would rather die than submit to his hands upon me, so you chose a different set of hands. Understanding dawned slowly, bringing with it a strange mixture of sympathy and resentment. You saw me in the trading post, a white stranger passing through, and you created this situation to escape the one you were already trapped in. She met his eyes without flinching. Yes, when you caught my arm, I saw an opportunity. A way to invoke a law that would bind me to someone other than Stone Dog. Someone who would take me away from here, away from him. And you did not think to simply ask for help? Would you have helped me? Her question cut to the heart of the matter. If a native woman had approached you in that trading post and begged you to marry her to save her from an unwanted suitor, would you have agreed? Or would you have laughed, finished your whiskey, and ridden away without a second thought? The honest answer shamed him, and she could see it in his face. She nodded slowly. Vindication and sorrow mingled in her expression. I did what I had to do to survive. I will not apologize for that. Caleb rose from the cot and walked to the window, looking out at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the morning mist and revealing a landscape that seemed to go on forever in every direction. Somewhere out there was the life he had been living before yesterday, the aimless wandering that had become his only purpose since leaving the army. It had not been much of a life, but it had been his, uncomplicated by obligations to anyone but himself. Now a woman he had known for less than a day was asking him to give up that freedom to save her from a fate she feared more than death itself. The weight of the decision pressed against his chest like a physical burden, and he found himself thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment, the war, the cavalry, the years of drinking and drifting that had followed. What happens if I agree? He asked without turning around. What exactly am I agreeing to? Winona's voice came from behind him, steady but uncertain. You would become my husband in the eyes of my people. We would need to participate in a ceremony, exchange vows according to our traditions. After that, I would be yours, and Stone Dog would have no further claim on me. And then what? Caleb turned to face her, needing to see her expression as she answered. We ride off into the sunset together. Play house on some homestead while pretending this marriage is something other than a convenient arrangement. She flinched slightly at his words, but her gaze did not waver. I would not expect you to stay with me forever. Once we are away from here, once I am safe from Stone Dog's reach, you could go your own way. I would not hold you to vows made under duress. So you want a husband in name only, a shield to hide behind until the danger passes. I want to survive. Her voice cracked slightly on the word, revealing depths of fear and desperation that her composed exterior had hidden. I want to wake up each morning without wondering if this is the day Stone Dog finally convinces my father that resistance is futile. I want to have some say in my own future, even if that say is limited to choosing which stranger I bind myself to. Caleb studied her face, searching for deception and finding only exhausted honesty. She was not trying to trap him into something permanent. She was drowning, reaching for any hand that might pull her to safety, and he happened to be the one standing closest to the water's edge. Tell me about Stone Dog, he said. Help me understand what we would be up against if I agree to this. Winona's expression darkened at the name, shadows gathering behind her eyes like storm clouds on the horizon. He is the son of a war chief who died fighting the Bluecoats 10 winters ago. He grew up believing that violence is the answer to every problem, that strength is measured only by how much pain you can inflict on others. Among our young warriors, he is admired for his ferocity in battle and his refusal to bow to the white man's treaties. He sounds like a man who does not accept defeat gracefully. He is a man who has never been defeated. Winona's hands clenched in her lap. Every woman he has wanted, he has taken. Every rival who has challenged him has been broken or killed. My father is one of the few leaders who still opposes him openly, and even that opposition grows weaker with each passing season as Stone Dog's followers multiply. And if you marry me instead, what happens to your father? A flash of guilt crossed her features, quickly suppressed. My father knows what I am doing. He does not approve, but he understands that keeping me here means eventually losing me to Stone Dog anyway. At least this way, I have a chance at something other than becoming that monster's property. Caleb absorbed this information, adding it to the complex picture forming in his mind. This was not simply a young woman fleeing an unwanted suitor. This was a political situation, a power struggle within the tribe that had been building for years. By inserting himself into the middle of it, he would be making enemies of men who had spent their entire lives learning to kill. "If I refuse," he said slowly, "your father really will demand my life. He will have no choice." Winona's voice was flat with resignation. "The law has been invoked before witnesses. If he allows you to walk away without consequence, he loses what remains of his authority. Stone Dog will use that weakness to finally push him aside, and I will be taken regardless of anyone's wishes. So my options are marriage or death. Those have always been your options. I simply made them explicit." Despite the grimness of the situation, Caleb found himself almost admiring her ruthlessness. She had seen an opportunity and seized it with both hands, manipulating circumstances to serve her needs with a calculating intelligence that belied her years. In another life, she might have been a general, a politician, a captain of industry. Instead, she was a young woman fighting for survival with the only weapons available to her. "You understand that I have nothing to offer you," he said. "No money, no land, no prospects. I have been wandering for 2 years with no direction and no purpose. If you are looking for someone to build a life with, you have chosen poorly. I am looking for someone who is not Stone Dog." Her eyes met his with fierce intensity. "Everything else is secondary." The sun had moved noticeably higher during their conversation, marking the passage of time that Caleb could not afford to waste. He thought about the life waiting for him beyond this room, the endless riding, the anonymous towns, the whiskey bottles that never quite managed to drown his demons. He thought about the woman sitting before him, brave and desperate and willing to risk everything on a stranger's mercy. He thought about the fact that he had not felt truly alive in years, and how the fear and uncertainty of this moment were making his blood sing in ways that peaceful wandering never had. "What happens next?" he asked quietly. "If I say yes?" Winona's expression shifted at his question, hope and disbelief warring across her features before she forced them back under control. "If you say yes, we go to my father immediately. The ceremony must happen before sunset, before the deadline he gave you expires. Once we are married according to our laws, Stone Dog cannot touch me without declaring war on my father's entire band. And after the ceremony, we leave. Tonight, if possible. I have supplies hidden near the river, enough to get us several days' travel from here. The farther we are from Stone Dog's reach, the safer we both will be." "You have been planning this for some time," Caleb observed. "I have been planning my escape since Stone Dog first made his intentions known." Winona rose from the chair, moving toward him with urgent energy. "I did not know what form that escape would take, but I knew I had to be ready when the opportunity appeared." "You are that opportunity, Caleb Hartley." He raised an eyebrow. "You know my name. I asked the trading post owner about you last night. After I decided to invoke the law, she met his surprised look without apology. I know you are a former cavalry soldier, that you have been drifting through the territory for 2 years, that you drink too much and speak too little. I know you have no family waiting for you, no obligations pulling you in any particular direction. You are exactly what I needed, a man with nothing to lose. The accuracy of her assessment stung more than he wanted to admit. She had reduced his entire existence to a handful of observations, and none of them were flattering. But she was also right. He had nothing to lose because he had already lost everything that mattered years ago, in muddy battlefields and smoky cavalry camps, and the bottom of countless whiskey bottles. "What about love?" he asked, the question surprising even himself. "Does that mean nothing to your people?" Winona's expression softened slightly, the first glimpse of vulnerability she had allowed him to see. "Love is a luxury that women in my position cannot afford. I have seen what happens to girls who follow their hearts instead of their heads. They end up dead or broken, or sold to men who see them as property." She paused, gathering herself. "But I have also seen marriages that began with practicality and grew into something more. My own mother was given to my father as part of a treaty agreement. They did not love each other when they wed, but by the time she died, he had become half a man without her. So there is hope for us yet." The words came out more sarcastically than he intended, and he saw her flinch at his tone. He softened his voice. "I apologize. This is not how I expected to spend my morning, nor I. But here we are." "Here we are," he agreed. He looked out the window one more time, watching the prairie grass bend beneath the wind, then turned back to face her with a decision made. "Tell your father, I agree to the marriage." The relief that flooded Winona's face was so profound that it transformed her entirely. For a moment, she was not a desperate woman clinging to survival, but simply a young person who had been granted an unexpected reprieve from a terrible fate. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, composing herself, then opened them again with renewed determination. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know this is not what you wanted. I know I have manipulated you into a corner from which there was no honorable escape. But I swear to you, Caleb Hartley, I will not be a burden. Once we are away from here, once we are safe, I will ask nothing more of you than you are willing to give." He nodded, accepting her promise without fully believing it. Circumstances had a way of changing, and the obligations that seemed simple in moments of crisis often grew complicated when the immediate danger passed. But that was a problem for another day. Winona moved to the door and spoke rapidly to Grey Wolf in their native tongue. The warrior's response was curt, suspicious, but he stepped aside to allow her to pass. She gestured for Caleb to follow, and together they walked out into the bright morning sunlight, where Chief Running Bear waited with the patience of a man accustomed to the slow unfolding of important events. "He has agreed," Winona told her father. "We must begin the preparations immediately." Running Bear's dark eyes moved to Caleb, searching his face for signs of deception or reluctance. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he gave a single sharp nod and spoke to his daughter in their language before turning to address Caleb directly. "You understand what you are taking on, white soldier? A Lakota wife is not like your white women, meek and silent. She will speak her mind and expect to be heard. She will work beside you as a partner, not beneath you as a servant. Can you accept this?" "I spent 4 years taking orders from men who were not half as intelligent as your daughter," Caleb replied. "I think I can manage a wife who has opinions." Something that might have been approval flickered across the chief's weathered face. "Good. Come. We have much to do before the sun sets." The walk to the Lakota camp took nearly an hour, following a path that wound through tall grass and across a shallow creek before emerging into a valley where dozens of teepees stood in careful arrangement, People stopped their work to watch as Caleb passed, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile, and he felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure against his skin. He was entering a world he did not understand, binding himself to a woman he had known for mere hours, making enemies of warriors who would happily see him dead. Every instinct he possessed screamed that this was madness, that he should turn and run before the trap closed completely around him. But Winona walked beside him with her head held high and her shoulders set with determination, and something about her courage made his own feel less like foolishness and more like the first meaningful choice he had made in years. The ceremony preparations began immediately upon their arrival at the camp. Winona was whisked away by a group of older women who regarded Caleb with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility, leaving him alone with Running Bear and Grey Wolf in a teepee that smelled of sage and wood smoke. The chief's son had not spoken a single word to Caleb since their initial confrontation, but his silence communicated more eloquently than speech ever could. "You will need to change your clothing," Running Bear said, gesturing toward a bundle of buckskin garments that had been laid out on a buffalo robe. "The ceremony requires traditional dress. Your soldier's coat has no place in a Lakota wedding." Caleb picked up the shirt, running his fingers over the intricate beadwork that decorated its surface. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each bead placed with precision and care, forming patterns that seemed to tell stories he could not read. Someone had spent months creating this garment, and he felt suddenly unworthy of wearing it. "This belonged to someone," he said. "Someone important. It belonged to my brother." Grey Wolf's voice was harsh, breaking his long silence. "He died 3 winters ago fighting the Bluecoats at the place your people call Wounded Ridge. You wear his wedding shirt to marry my sister, and you dare to ask if it belonged to someone important." The hostility in the young warrior's words was unmistakable, and Caleb understood it completely. He was an outsider, a representative of the culture that had taken so much from these people, and now he was being given the sacred garments of a fallen hero to participate in a ceremony he had no right to attend. "I meant no disrespect," Caleb said carefully. "I only wish to acknowledge that I am being given something precious. I will try to honor your brother's memory by wearing it with the dignity he deserved." Grey Wolf's eyes narrowed, searching for mockery and apparently finding none. He gave a curt nod and left the teepee without another word, leaving Caleb alone with the chief. "My son does not trust you," Running Bear observed. "He believes Winona is making a mistake, that she would be better served accepting Stone Dog's offer than binding herself to a white stranger. And what do you believe?" The chief was silent for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "I believe my daughter is the most intelligent person I have ever known," he said finally. "She sees patterns where others see only chaos, anticipates dangers before they materialize, plans for contingencies that no one else has considered. If she has chosen you, there is a reason. I may not understand it, but I trust her judgment. Even if her judgment leads her away from your people forever, nothing is forever." Running Bear's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "The world is changing, soldier. The old ways are dying, no matter how desperately some of us try to preserve them. Perhaps my daughter sees a path forward that I cannot imagine. Perhaps her children will walk in both worlds, carrying the best of what we were into whatever comes next." The words struck Caleb with unexpected force. He had spent so long thinking of the native peoples as obstacles to be overcome or enemies to be defeated, that he had never considered them as human beings grappling with the same uncertainties that plagued everyone else. Running Bear was not a savage chieftain clinging to primitive customs. He was a father trying to protect his daughter in a world that offered precious few protections to anyone. "I will do my best to keep her safe," Caleb said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "I cannot promise to be a good husband, but I can promise to try. That is all any of us can do." Running Bear moved toward the teepee's entrance, then paused. The ceremony will begin at sunset. Until then, remain here. There are those in the camp who would welcome an excuse to challenge you, and I cannot protect you from every confrontation. Stone Dog, among others. The chief's expression darkened. He arrived this morning, shortly after we left for the trading post. He has been gathering his supporters, speaking against this marriage, calling it an insult to our people. You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this day will end in blood. With that ominous warning, Running Bear departed, leaving Caleb alone with the borrowed wedding clothes and his own turbulent thoughts. He changed out of his cavalry jacket slowly, folding it with care that surprised him given how little he had valued it mere hours ago. The buckskin shirt fit surprisingly well, as did the leggings and moccasins that accompanied it. When he caught his reflection in a small mirror hanging on the teepee's wall, he barely recognized himself. The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. Caleb could hear movement outside, voices rising and falling in conversations he could not understand, occasional shouts that might have been arguments or celebrations. He tried to rest, knowing that the night ahead might demand everything he had, but sleep refused to come. Instead, he lay on the buffalo robe and stared at the teepee's peaked ceiling, thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. He thought about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about the farm his father had worked until the war came and took everything. He thought about the battles he had survived, the friends he had buried, the pieces of himself he had left scattered across blood-soaked fields. He thought about the years of wandering that followed, the desperate search for something that might fill the emptiness inside him, the gradual acceptance that perhaps nothing ever would. And now this, a marriage to a woman he barely knew, in a culture he did not understand, surrounded by people who saw him as an enemy at worst and a necessary inconvenience at best. It was absurd, impossible, the kind of situation that only existed in the dime novels he had occasionally read to pass the time. But Winona's face kept appearing in his mind, her dark eyes blazing with determination as she pointed at him in the bunkhouse doorway. She had looked at him and seen not a broken soldier drowning in whiskey and regret, but an opportunity, a chance, a future different from the one that had been chosen for her. In her desperation, she had granted him something he had not realized he was missing. She had made him matter to someone again. The sun was touching the western horizon when Running Bear returned to escort Caleb to the ceremony. The camp had transformed during the afternoon, fires lit in a wide circle around a central clearing, people gathering in clusters that seemed to divide along invisible lines of allegiance. Caleb could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke, and he understood immediately that this wedding had become something larger than a simple union between two people. Winona stood at the center of the clearing, and the sight of her stole the breath from his lungs. She wore a white buckskin dress that seemed to glow in the fading light, its surface covered with beadwork even more intricate than his borrowed shirt. Her dark hair had been braided with ribbons of red and white, and turquoise jewelry adorned her throat, wrists, and ears. She looked like something from a dream, ethereal and untouchable, and Caleb felt suddenly conscious of his own unworthiness. But it was her expression that caught him most powerfully. Her dark eyes found his across the crowded clearing, and in them he saw not the desperate calculation of the woman who had trapped him into this arrangement, but something softer, more vulnerable. She was afraid, he realized, afraid that he would change his mind, that Stone Dog would intervene, that the fragile hope she had constructed would shatter before it could become real. He walked toward her without hesitation, ignoring the hostile glares from warriors positioned throughout the crowd, focusing only on the woman who would become his wife. When he reached her side, she released a breath she had clearly been holding, and her hand found his with trembling fingers. "You came," she whispered. "I gave my word." Before she could respond, A commotion erupted at the edge of the clearing. The crowd parted to reveal a man Caleb had never seen before, but recognized immediately from Winona's description. Stone Dog was massive, nearly as tall as Caleb, but broader through the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cruelty that twisted his features. He strode into the circle of firelight with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, flanked by half a dozen warriors who shared his aggressive bearing. "This ceremony is a mockery," Stone Dog declared, his voice carrying across the clearing. "A white soldier cannot marry a Lakota woman. The old laws do not apply to those who have no respect for our ways." Running Bear stepped forward, his own bearing radiating the authority of decades of leadership. "The laws apply to all who stand on Lakota land. The ceremony will proceed. You would give your daughter to an enemy of our people?" Stone Dog's voice dripped with contempt. "You would pollute our bloodlines with white man's seed? Your brother died fighting these soldiers, and now you welcome one into your family." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Caleb could see the effect of Stone Dog's words on those assembled. The warrior was not just challenging the marriage, he was challenging Running Bear's fitness to lead, using this ceremony as a weapon in a larger battle for control of the band. "My daughter makes her own choices," Running Bear replied steadily, "as is her right under our traditions. Her choice is to dishonor herself and her people." Stone Dog turned his attention to Winona, his eyes raking over her with possessive hunger. "You could have had a warrior worthy of your beauty. Instead, you choose this broken white man who reeks of whiskey and defeat. What does that say about your judgment?" "It says that I would rather marry a stranger than become the property of a man who sees women as things to be owned." Winona's voice rang out clear and strong, silencing the murmurs that had spread through the crowd. "You speak of honor, Stone Dog, but you have none. You speak of our traditions, but you twist them to serve your own ambitions. I reject you, as I have rejected you since the day you first demanded my father give me to you, like a horse or a blanket." The fury that crossed Stone Dog's face was terrifying in its intensity. For a moment, Caleb thought the warrior would attack them right there in the sacred clearing. Ceremony and consequences be damned. His hand moved instinctively toward his hip before he remembered that he was unarmed, his weapons left behind in the tepee along with his cavalry jacket. "You will regret those words," Stone Dog growled, "and so will your white man." He turned and stalked away, his followers close behind. But Caleb knew with cold certainty that the confrontation was far from over. Stone Dog had been publicly humiliated in front of his people, and men like him did not forget such insults. The wedding might proceed, but their troubles were only beginning. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Caleb had experienced. An elder whose face was painted with sacred symbols spoke words in Lakota that he could not understand, but whose rhythm and cadence conveyed their importance. Winona translated softly, explaining that they were being called upon to pledge themselves to each other before the spirits of earth and sky, to walk together through whatever challenges the future might bring. When the time came to exchange vows, Winona spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. She promised to stand beside him in times of hardship, to share equally in times of plenty, to honor his courage and forgive his weaknesses, to build a life together that honored both their peoples. Then it was his turn, and Caleb found words rising from somewhere deep inside him, words he had not planned and could not have anticipated. He promised to protect her with his life, to respect her wisdom and her independence, to learn her ways even as he shared his own, to become worthy of the trust she had placed in him. As he spoke, he realized with startling clarity that he meant every word. The elder concluded the ceremony by binding their hands together with a leather cord, dyed red with sacred pigments, symbolizing the blood bond they now shared. When the cord was tied, a great cheer went up from those who supported the union, drowning out the sullen silence of Stone Dog's allies. Caleb looked at Winona, his wife now in the eyes of her people, if not yet in the eyes of his, and saw something new in her expression. Hope, certainly, but also something warmer, something that suggested their marriage of convenience might have the potential to become something more. Then the celebration began, and there was no more time for reflection. The celebration continued deep into the night, with drums beating rhythms that seemed to pulse in time with Caleb's own heartbeat, and voices raised in songs that told stories of love, courage, and the eternal cycle of life. Food was pressed into his hands by women who had regarded him with suspicion mere hours before, their expressions now softened by the sacred bond that had been formed. He ate without tasting, drank without noticing, his attention constantly drawn to the woman who sat beside him, her hand still warm in his. Winona had relaxed as the evening progressed, the desperate tension that had defined her since their first meeting gradually giving way to something approaching genuine happiness. She laughed at jokes told in Lakota, translated the most important comments for his benefit, and introduced him to family members whose names he immediately forgot in the overwhelming flood of new faces and experiences. But even as she smiled and celebrated, her eyes kept darting to the edges of the firelight, searching the shadows for threats that both of them knew were coming. Stone Dog had not returned to the celebration, but his absence was somehow more ominous than his presence would have been. A man that angry, that humiliated, would not simply accept defeat and move on. He was planning something, and the not knowing what made the waiting almost unbearable. "We should leave soon," Winona whispered during a lull in the festivities. "I have horses waiting near the river, supplies cached in a hollow oak about a mile downstream. If we slip away during the dancing, we can be gone before anyone notices. Will your father not expect us to stay for the traditional wedding night?" "My father expects us to survive." She squeezed his hand with urgent pressure. "He knows what Stone Dog is capable of, and he knows that our best chance is to put as much distance between us and this place as possible before dawn." Caleb nodded, trusting her judgment in matters she understood far better than he did. "What about Grey Wolf? Your brother did not seem pleased with this arrangement." "My brother loves me, despite his doubts about you. He has been watching Stone Dog's movements all evening, and he will create a distraction when the time comes." She paused, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Whatever happens tonight, Caleb, I want you to know that I am grateful. You did not have to agree to this. You could have called my bluff, forced me to admit that the sacred law was not as binding as I claimed. Instead, you chose to help me, and I will not forget that." "You did not give me much choice," he reminded her, but without the bitterness he might have felt earlier. "You trapped me fairly. I trapped us both." Her smile was rueful, but genuine. "Now we must find our way out together." The signal came an hour later, a sudden commotion on the far side of the camp as Grey Wolf's voice rose in apparent drunken argument with another warrior. Heads turned, attention shifted, and Winona's fingers tightened around Caleb's wrist. "Now," she breathed. They slipped away from the celebration with the practiced ease of people who had spent their lives learning to move without being noticed. Winona led him through the darkened camp, avoiding the paths where they might encounter others, ducking behind teepees and storage structures until they reached the edge of the encampment. The prairie stretched before them, silver and black under the light of a half-moon, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The horses were where she had promised, two sturdy paints tied in a grove of cottonwoods near the riverbank. Winona moved to check their provisions with quick, efficient hands, while Caleb kept watch, his senses straining for any sign of pursuit. The night was quiet except for the distant sounds of celebration and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. "Everything is here," Winona reported. "We can ride through the night and be 30 miles away by sunrise. There is a trading settlement to the south where we can resupply before continuing east." "East toward what?" "Toward whatever comes next." She swung onto her horse with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. I have contacts in several towns along the river, people who owe my father favors and will help us establish ourselves somewhere safe. Beyond that, I do not know. We will figure it out together. Caleb mounted his own horse, feeling the animal shift beneath him as it adjusted to his unfamiliar weight. He had spent countless hours in the saddle during his cavalry days, but this was different. This was not riding toward a battle or away from a defeat. This was riding toward a future he could not imagine with a woman he was only beginning to know. They had just urged their horses into motion when the arrow sang past Caleb's ear, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. He threw himself forward against his horse's neck as a second arrow struck the tree behind him, and Winona's cry of warning was nearly drowned out by the thunder of approaching hooves. Stone Dog emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given flesh, his face painted for war and his eyes blazing with murderous intent. Behind him rode 6 warriors, their weapons drawn and their expressions making clear that they had not come to talk. "You thought you could steal what belongs to me," Stone Dog shouted, bringing his horse to a rearing halt barely 20 feet away. "You thought a few words from an old man could break my claim on this woman?" "She was never yours to claim," Caleb replied, positioning his horse between the warriors and Winona. "She made her choice freely, and you will respect it." Stone Dog's laugh was ugly, devoid of any humor. "The only choice she made was to die beside a white man instead of living as a warrior's wife. So be it. I will kill you both and tell the elders that you attacked me when I tried to convince you to return peacefully. No one will question my word against that of a dead soldier." He raised his bow, and Caleb knew with cold certainty that he had perhaps 3 seconds to live. The arrow never came. Instead, a rifle shot cracked through the night air, and the bow flew from Stone Dog's hands as the bullet struck its wooden frame, shattering it into splinters. The warrior screamed in rage and pain as fragments tore into his fingers, and his horse reared in panic at the unexpected sound. Caleb did not waste time wondering who had fired the shot. He kicked his horse forward, closing the distance between himself and Stone Dog before the warrior could recover, and launched himself from the saddle in a tackle that sent them both crashing to the ground. They rolled through the tall grass, grappling for advantage, and Caleb felt the familiar calm of combat settle over him like a second skin. Stone Dog was strong, perhaps the strongest man Caleb had ever fought. But strength alone did not win battles. 4 years of cavalry service had taught him that speed, precision, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary mattered far more than raw power. He drove his elbow into Stone Dog's throat, feeling cartilage crunch beneath the blow, then rolled away before the warrior's flailing hands could find purchase. Around them, chaos erupted as Stone Dog's followers found themselves under attack from multiple directions. Grey Wolf had emerged from the darkness with 6 warriors loyal to Running Bear, their rifles and bows making short work of men who had expected an easy ambush. The night filled with shouts and the sounds of combat, but Caleb's attention remained fixed on the man who had tried to kill him. Stone Dog staggered to his feet, one hand clutching his damaged throat, the other drawing the knife at his belt. His eyes were wild with fury and pain, but beneath the madness Caleb could see calculation. The warrior knew he was losing, knew that his carefully planned ambush had failed, but he was not willing to accept defeat. Men like Stone Dog never were. "You should have stayed away, white man." The words came out as a rasping whisper, damaged by Caleb's blow but still dripping with venom. "She would have learned to accept me eventually. They always do. She would have died first." Caleb circled slowly, keeping his weight balanced and his hands ready. "And so will you, if you do not surrender now." Stone Dog's answer was a lunge, his knife slashing toward Caleb's midsection with speed that belied his injuries. Caleb twisted aside, feeling the blade whisper past his ribs, and countered with a strike to the warrior's damaged hand that sent the knife spinning into the darkness. They stood facing each other, both breathing hard, both knowing that this fight could only end one way. The warrior charged again, abandoning technique in favor of brute force, his massive arms reaching to crush the life from his enemy. Caleb let him come, timing his movement with the precision that years of training had burned into his muscles, then pivoted at the last moment and used Stone Dog's own momentum to send him crashing face first into the trunk of a cottonwood tree. The impact was tremendous, the sound of bone-meeting wood echoing across the clearing. Stone Dog slumped to the ground and did not rise, his face a ruin of blood and broken bone, his breathing shallow and irregular. He was not dead, but he would never threaten anyone again. Caleb stood over his fallen enemy, chest heaving, hands trembling with the aftermath of violence. He had killed men before, in battle and in the desperate skirmishes that followed the war, but he had never enjoyed it. The necessity of taking life had always left him feeling hollow, diminished, further removed from the person he had once hoped to become. But this time was different. This time he had fought not for a cause he did not believe in, or orders he did not understand, but for something that mattered. He had fought for Winona, for their future together, for the possibility that two broken people might somehow build something whole. Caleb. Her voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, and he turned to find her standing a few feet away, her face pale in the moonlight but her eyes bright with relief. "Are you hurt?" He looked down at himself, taking inventory of cuts and bruises that he had not noticed during the fight. Nothing serious. "What about the others?" "Grey Wolf and his warriors have the situation under control." She moved closer, her hand reaching out to touch his face with trembling fingers. "Stone Dog's followers are surrendering. They have no stomach for fighting without their leader to drive them forward. And Stone Dog himself?" They both looked at the crumpled figure beneath the cottonwood tree. He was still breathing, but the rasping sound suggested internal injuries that would likely prove fatal without immediate treatment. Even if he survived, the damage to his face and throat would leave him forever changed, a broken shadow of the warrior who had terrorized so many. "Leave him," Winona said, her voice hard with years of accumulated fear and anger. "Let his own people decide what to do with him. We have our own path to follow." Caleb nodded, turning away from his defeated enemy without regret. The violence was over, at least for now, and the future stretched before them like the endless prairie, full of challenges and possibilities they could not yet imagine. Grey Wolf approached as they mounted their horses, his expression complex with emotions that Caleb could not fully read. "You fought well, white man." He spoke the words as if they cost him something precious. "Perhaps my sister did not choose as poorly as I believed. Perhaps not." Caleb extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Grey Wolf clasped it firmly. "Take care of your father. He will need strong sons in the days ahead. And you take care of my sister." The warning in Grey Wolf's voice was unmistakable, but beneath it Caleb heard something else. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of acceptance. "If you hurt her, I will find you no matter how far you run." "I believe you would." Caleb released the warrior's hand and gathered his reins. "But I do not intend to give you reason to try." They rode away from the battlefield as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, leaving behind the violence and the politics and the complicated web of obligations that had bound them both. The prairie opened before them like a promise, vast and challenging and beautiful in the pale morning light. Winona guided her horse close to his, and their hands found each other across the small distance. 3 months had passed since the night they fled Running Bear's camp. 3 months of hard riding and harder decisions, of learning to navigate a world that had little place for a union like theirs. They had traveled east as Winona had planned, stopping at trading posts and small settlements where her father's contacts provided shelter and supplies, always moving before anyone could ask too many questions about the white man and the Lakota woman who traveled together as husband and wife. The cabin they had finally settled in stood at the edge of a valley in the Montana foothills, far enough from any town to avoid the suspicious stares and whispered comments that had followed them throughout their journey, but close enough to trade when necessary. It was small, barely 2 rooms, but Caleb had spent the past month making improvements, adding a proper chimney, reinforcing the walls against the coming winter, building furniture from the pine trees that covered the surrounding slopes. Winona had transformed the interior into something that felt surprisingly like home, hanging dried herbs from the rafters, arranging their few possessions with the same careful attention she had given to planning their escape, creating warmth and comfort from almost nothing. She had a gift for making beauty from simple materials, and Caleb found himself constantly surprised by the small touches she added: a carved wooden bowl she had traded for at the last settlement, a blanket woven in traditional patterns that she worked on during the long evenings. They had learned to live together during those months, navigating the awkward territory between strangers and spouses with patience that sometimes surprised them both. There had been arguments, certainly, clashes of culture and expectation that left them sleeping on opposite sides of the cabin's single room. But there had also been moments of unexpected connection, conversations that stretched late into the night, shared laughter over the absurdity of their situation, quiet mornings watching the sun rise over the mountains while coffee steamed in their hands. The first time he kissed her, really kissed her with intention and desire, rather than the formal gestures required by their wedding ceremony, she had pulled back with wide eyes and asked him why. He had not known how to answer, had not known himself why the distance between them had become unbearable, why her smile had started making his chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with the old war wounds. He only knew that somewhere along the way, the marriage of convenience had become something else entirely. She had kissed him back eventually, and what followed had changed everything between them. Now Caleb stood on the cabin's small porch, watching Winona work in the garden she had planted beside the house. Her belly had begun to swell with the child they had created during those first tender explorations of genuine intimacy, and the sight of her filled him with emotions he had never expected to feel again. Fear, certainly, at the responsibility of bringing a new life into a world that could be so cruel. But also joy, fierce and unexpected, at the thought of building a family with this remarkable woman who had trapped him into marriage and somehow set him free in the process. She looked up from her work, catching him watching her, and smiled with the easy warmth that had replaced her desperate calculation. "What are you thinking about, husband?" The word still sent a thrill through him every time she used it. "Thinking about how wrong I was that first morning when I told you I had nothing to offer any woman. And now I understand that I was measuring with the wrong scale." He descended the porch steps and crossed to where she knelt among the growing vegetables. "I thought wealth and property were what mattered. I did not realize that what a woman truly needs is someone willing to fight for her, to stand beside her, to build something together from nothing but determination and hope." Winona rose, placing her earth-stained hand against his cheek. "You have given me all of those things, and more besides." He covered her hand with his own, marveling as he did every day at the path that had led him to this moment. A year ago, he had been drowning in whiskey and regret, convinced that the best parts of his life were behind him. Now he stood in the shadow of mountains, with a wife he loved and a child on the way, building a future he had never dared to imagine. "The sacred law that brought us together," he said slowly. "You told me once that you had invoked it out of desperation, that the custom existed but was rarely used. Do you ever regret the deception?" Winona was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "I regret the fear that drove me to it. I regret that I did not trust you enough to simply ask for help." She paused, her hand moving to rest on the swell of her belly. "But I cannot regret the result. Whatever manipulation brought us together, what we have built since then is real. This love is real." He pulled her close, careful of the precious burden she carried, and pressed his lips to her forehead. "I love you, Winona Hartley. I did not expect to, did not plan for it. But I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life. And I love you, Caleb." She tilted her face up to meet his eyes. "My accidental husband, my unlikely protector, the father of my child. I love you." They stood together in the mountain sunlight, two people from different worlds who had found in each other something neither had expected. The past stretched behind them, full of pain and loss and desperate choices, but the future opened before them like the valley below their cabin, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. In the distance, an eagle circled on the thermal currents, riding the wind toward horizons they could not see. Caleb watched it soar and thought about the strange journey that had brought him here, from cavalry soldier to drifter to husband and soon-to-be father. Sacred law had demanded he take her as wife, but love had transformed that demand into the greatest gift he had ever received. The eagle disappeared over the mountains, and Caleb turned back to the woman in his arms, ready to face whatever came next. Together,